U.S. General Lloyd Fredendall. Guys, this man was less of a military commander and more of a paranoid interior decorator. With an unlimited budget. Deployed to North Africa for Operation Torch, Fredendall was tasked with leading American forces against Rommel's hardened Afrika Corps. This was America's big debut in the European African theater. The world was watching. And what did Fredendall do? He immediately focused on what was truly important. Building himself a ridiculously elaborate bomb-proof bunker. I'm not exaggerating. He tasked an entire engineering battalion, the same number of men who built the Pentagon, with blasting a massive command complex out of a mountainside. This bunker was a full 100 miles away from the front lines he was supposed to be commanding. He insisted on speaking in a bizarre self-made code, referring to infantry as walking boys and artillery as plowing boys. His subordinates had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. It was chaos. So when the Germans finally attacked at Kasserine Pass, was anyone surprised that Fredendall's leadership completely disintegrated? He had no idea where his units were. He issued contradictory orders, and his troops, poorly led and confused, were utterly routed in one of the most humiliating American defeats of the war. Eisenhower was so furious he sacked him almost immediately. British Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the man who orchestrated the single most humiliating surrender in British military history, the fall of Singapore. On paper, Percival should have been untouchable. He had over 85,000 Commonwealth troops under his command. The attacking Japanese force? They had just over 30,000. That's nearly a 3-to-1 advantage. Yet Percival was utterly convinced the Japanese would attack from the sea, so all of Singapore's famous, massive coastal guns were pointed in the wrong direction when Japanese forces came through the jungle from the north. When the Japanese commander Tomoyuki Yamashita demanded his surrender, Percival, despite his overwhelming numbers, just caved. Italian Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. This guy wasn't just incompetent, he was monstrous. Known as the Butcher of Ethiopia for his brutal war crimes there before World War II even started, Graziani was put in command of the Italian 10th Army in North Africa. He had a massive numerical advantage over the British forces opposing him. We're talking about a 5-to-1 superiority in troops. His orders from Mussolini were simple: invade Egypt. And he did, sort of. He advanced a whole 60 miles into Egypt, and then, completely paralyzed by fear and indecision, he just stopped. For 3 months, he did absolutely nothing, allowing the vastly outnumbered British to build up their forces and plan a counterattack. He was so terrified of the British that he famously told his own staff, "When you have a superiority of tanks, you have this feeling of being safe." It's like, dude, you're the one with the superiority! When the British finally launched their counteroffensive Operation Compass, they didn't just stop Graziani, they annihilated him. A tiny British force of 30,000 men completely destroyed his army of 150,000, taking over 130,000 prisoners. Soviet Marshal Semyon Budyani. Budyani was a classic case of a guy who was great in the last war and absolutely useless in the current one. He was an old Bolshevik crony of Stalin's, a legendary cavalry commander from the Russian Civil War. The problem? By 1941, cavalry wasn't exactly cutting-edge military technology. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, Budyani was placed in command of the Southwestern Front, tasked with defending Ukraine. He was facing the likes of Gerhard von Rundstedt and Heinz Guderian, the architects of Blitzkrieg. And what was Budyani's brilliant strategy? Cavalry charges. He literally ordered his men on horseback to charge German machine gun nests and panzer divisions. The result was exactly what you'd expect, a complete and utter massacre. His refusal to adapt, his insistence on outdated tactics, and his mindless belief in the offensive charge created the perfect trap. The Germans encircled his forces near Kiev in what became the largest single encirclement in military history. The Soviets lost 500,000 men, killed or captured, because one of Stalin's buddies thought dashing horses were a match for modern armor. Stalin eventually had to pull him out, but the damage was done. General Maurice Gamelin. Gamelin was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in France, and he was a man utterly trapped in the past. He was still fighting World War I. He was completely convinced that any German attack would be a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from 1914, coming through central Belgium. He staked everything on this assumption. All of France's best mobile units, its best tanks and troops, were sent north to meet this phantom attack. Meanwhile, he left the Ardennes forest, a hilly and wooded region, defended by only a handful of second-rate reserve divisions. Why? Because he, along with the entire French High Command, believed the forest was impenetrable to tanks. They just decided an entire section of the border was magically tank-proof. Of course, the Germans' main panzer thrust came directly through the impenetrable Ardennes. When the news came in, Gamelin's response was catastrophically slow. His command center was a joke, with no radios and reliant on motorcycle couriers for information. For hours on the most critical day of the invasion, he was completely unreachable. By the time he realized what was happening, German tanks were already pouring across France, his best armies were trapped in Belgium, and the battle for France was effectively lost in 6 weeks. Clement Voroshilov, another one of Stalin's old, unqualified cronies. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin, in his infinite wisdom, put Voroshilov in charge of defending Leningrad, the second most important city in the country. To say Voroshilov was out of his depth is a grotesque understatement. The man was a military fossil. His idea of defense was, like Budyani, completely archaic. He had no grasp of modern combined arms warfare. Instead of preparing layered defenses or using his armor effectively, he ordered suicidal counterattacks that bled the Red Army dry. He personally led one charge from the front armed with only a pistol, which sounds heroic until you realize the job of a commanding general isn't to play soldier, it's to command the army, and he was terrible at it. His ineptitude made it incredibly easy for the Germans to encircle Leningrad, beginning the infamous 872-day siege. Millions of civilians were trapped. Under Voroshilov's command, no adequate preparations had been made for a long siege. Food and fuel supplies were disastrously low. His failure to establish a strong defensive perimeter before the trap closed resulted in a level of human suffering that is almost impossible to comprehend. People starved to death in the streets. Stalin eventually replaced him with Georgy Zhukov, who managed to stabilize the front, but the damage was done. Voroshilov's appointment wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime.